The sound was faint at first, a muffled rasp that seemed to echo from inside a dull, dirt-streaked plastic bottle. It wasn't the sound of wind or the rustle of grass. It was breathing, weak and laboured, pushed through lungs that were losing strength with every second. Inside the translucent white shell, the outline of a small lion cub's head was barely visible. The rigid neck of the bottle had sunk deep into the soft fur and tender skin of his throat, leaving a swollen, darkened ring that pulsed with each painful swallow. His name was Quito, and his clouded eyes, dulled by exhaustion, seemed to search for something, anything, that could end this strange, suffocating nightmare. Beside him, another cub lingered so close their fur almost blended together in the dust and dying grass. Zuri, his younger brother by only a few minutes, pressed his small body against Quito's side, as if to shield him from a danger he couldn't see. His tongue brushed carefully around the bottle's rim where it bit into Quito's neck, each lick accompanied by a soft, anxious sound in the back of his throat. He didn't understand why his brother couldn't pull free. He only knew that Quito's scent carried the sharp tang of pain. It had been just 3 days since the brothers had been tumbling through the tall, golden grass under the watchful eyes of their pride in South Africa's Thulthula reserve. The air then had been filled with the scent of their mother, Nala, and the reassuring presence of other adults, each heartbeat steady and strong in the safe rhythm of the pride's life. Now, the safety of that world felt impossibly far away. The two cubs lay on the brittle verge of a paved road, miles from where they had last slept among their kin. Quito's breathing came in shallow bursts. Without the ability to eat or drink, his 4-month-old body was quickly surrendering to the slow theft of strength. Yet even in the midst of this struggle, the most astonishing thing was not Quito's stubborn will to survive. It was Zuri's refusal to leave him. 3 days of hunger and thirst had not pulled him away, even though instinct whispered that he could return to the pride, to safety and food. Something stronger than instinct anchored him here, a thread between brothers that no danger, no hardship had been able to sever. It was a bond so unyielding, it could almost be mistaken for something human, a quiet, fierce devotion. It had all begun on a bright, wind-swept morning. The air was warm, carrying the scents of earth and prey, and the pride was gathered in the shade after a night of hunting. Nala lay still, her eyes half closed, recovering from wounds she'd earned driving off a pack of hyenas. The other adults dozed, bellies full, their tails flicking lazily against flies. No one noticed when the two cubs, buzzing with restless energy, slipped away from the sleeping circle. At first, it was just a game, a butterfly that darted just beyond reach, a young antelope in the distance that startled and leapt away. They chased one thing, then another, their small paws carrying them farther from the place where they'd been born. The land began to change. The grass thinned, no longer lush but sparse and brittle, patches of bare earth showing between clumps. The air shifted too. Beneath the smell of dust and acacia came something unfamiliar. Acrid smoke, the faint sweetness of rotting fruit, the metallic tang of rust. Neither of them knew they were approaching the reserve's northern border, where the thin wire fence did little to keep out the mess of the human world. Wind carried scraps and debris from nearby villages, dropping them here in heaps that gathered among the grass. Twisted metal, torn paper, and plastic in all shapes and colours. Quito's curiosity drew him forward. He pawed at a sheet of silver plastic that caught the sunlight and winked like water. He sniffed at a thin bag caught on a thorn bush, watching it tremble in the breeze. Zuri followed more slowly, head low, nose twitching with unease. There was something wrong about this place. The smells were sharp and unnatural, and the objects here made no sense to his young mind. But Quito had found something new. A large, clear plastic bottle lying half buried in the weeds, a few drops of amber liquid still clinging to the inside. The scent of the sweet residue was intoxicating. It curled into his nose and pulled him closer. He nosed the bottle, rolled it with a paw, then pushed his muzzle into its open mouth to lap at the taste. The drops were too deep inside to reach easily, so he pushed further. His head slid into the bottle with a faint scrape. The sensation of cool plastic on his ears and face startled him, but the sweet taste at the bottom urged him on. Then, in a single heartbeat, the sweetness turned to panic. The opening that had allowed his head in would not let it back out. He pulled once, twice, harder, his claws scrabbling at the ground, but each tug only made the stiff plastic ring bite deeper into his neck. The sharp edge began to press against the delicate skin, cutting where the fur parted. Zuri froze, wide-eyed, his ears flattening. At first, he thought it was another of Kito's games, one he would laugh off with a playful swat. But Kito's muffled growls turned into choked, desperate sounds. The bottle scraped and twisted as Kito thrashed, distorting his vision through the fogged, dirty plastic. Zuri bounded forward, trying to help, his small teeth tugging at the bottle's edge. The plastic wouldn't give. His efforts only made Kito flinch and whimper as the wound deepened. For hours they wrestled with it, Kito rolling in the dust, pressing his head against rocks, trying to wedge the bottle off. The sun slid down the sky, turning the grass gold, then red, then grey. By the time the light faded, Kito lay still except for the shallow lift and fall of his sides. His breathing rasped in Zuri's ears. Through the bottle's warped curve, Kito's eyes blinked slowly, clouded and confused. The night air grew cold, sharper than it had been in weeks. The brothers curled together, their bodies forming a small circle against the chill. Zuri tried calling out, his voice thin and high, a cub's cry meant for his mother. But the night swallowed the sound. Somewhere, far away, the pride slept on, unaware. Kito's stomach growled once, then went quiet. He pawed at the ground as if trying to lick moisture from the grass, but the bottle blocked him. His tongue scraped against hard plastic, tasting only the faint bitterness of its walls. Zuri pressed closer, wrapping his tail over Kito's back. His eyes stayed open long into the night, watching the shadows. When the wind shifted, carrying the distant howl of a jackal, he pressed tighter still, his small heartbeat thudding fast against Kito's side. He did not know how to free his brother. He only knew he would not leave. Not now. Not ever. The first pale streaks of light slid over the horizon, washing the dry grass in muted gold. Zuri lifted his head, his ears pricking toward the east, but his gaze returned immediately to Kito. The older cub was still curled on his side, the plastic bottle pressed against the ground, his breaths shallow and uneven. His fur was ruffled and dull now, and the swelling around his neck had grown worse overnight. Zuri leaned in and licked gently at the skin where the bottle cut into him, a soft, rhythmic motion that seemed as much an attempt to comfort as to clean. By mid-morning, the sun was already heavy and hot. The dry air sucked moisture from the earth and from their small bodies alike. Zuri kept nudging Kito, urging him to stand, to move, to do anything that might stir his strength. Kito staggered to his feet once, took 2 unsteady steps, and collapsed again with a muffled groan that the plastic distorted into something hollow and strange. The sound made Zuri flinch, but he stayed close, pacing in a small arc around his brother like a sentry. As the hours stretched on, hunger clawed at Zuri's belly. His own throat was dry, and he could feel the thirst scraping along the inside of his mouth. Yet every time he moved away to sniff at the grass or scan the horizon, his eyes flicked back to Kito, measuring the rise and fall of his chest. By midday, the heat shimmered over the land, distorting the view of the distant scrub. Somewhere far off, a call drifted through the air, a deep, familiar sound that made Zuri's ears twist sharply. It was the pride. He recognized the voice of one of the older lions, searching. Zuri froze, listening. Another call came, this time closer. An instinct surged through him. Run to them. Run to the pride, to food and water, and the comforting weight of their protection. His legs even twitched as if to obey. But when he looked at Kito, head still trapped, sides moving in slow, deliberate breaths, he stayed where he was. The thought of leaving his brother here, alone in this empty stretch of land, felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. He lay back down beside Kito, pressing his nose against the bottle as if to say, "I'm still here." As the sun dropped toward the west, shadows lengthened and the air began to cool. Zuri knew they needed water. He could smell it faintly on the breeze, a hint of damp earth from somewhere nearby. Torn between need and duty, he trotted a short distance from Kito, scanning for movement. His paws found a narrow animal trail that led into a small dip in the land where rainwater had collected in a shallow puddle. The water was muddy and tinged with the smell of algae, but it was life. He drank quickly at first, his throat aching with relief. Then an idea sparked. Simple, instinctive, but clever. He lowered his head again, taking in as much as he could hold, then bounded back toward Quito. The older cub stirred faintly as Zuri approached. Tilting his head, Zuri dribbled the water from his mouth into the small gap between the bottle's rim and Quito's fur. Most of it spilled down his chin, but a few precious drops slid inside. Quito's tongue moved weakly, catching the moisture. It wasn't much, but Zuri repeated the process again and again, back and forth between the puddle and his brother, until his legs trembled from the effort. By the time he stopped, the sun was low, painting the grass in streaks of fire. Zuri rested beside Quito, panting, his sides heaving. For a moment, he simply pressed his head against his brother's flank, listening to the faint thud of his heartbeat. He wished that could be enough to keep him alive. Night settled quickly, and with it came the sounds of the wild. A hyena's laugh echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the road. Zuri's ears flicked, his body stiffening. He pressed closer to Quito, curling around him to share warmth against the growing cold. The bottle made Quito's head awkwardly heavy. Sometimes it would tip forward as he slept, startling him awake with a rough gasp. Each time Zuri was there, licking his ear or pressing his nose to his side until the tremors passed. Morning of the second day came with a pale, washed-out sky. Quito's condition had worsened. The swelling around his neck had turned angry and red beneath the fur, and a sour scent clung to it. His eyes were half closed, the lids slow to lift when Zuri nudged him. Zuri's hunger was a gnawing ache now, sharper than before. He prowled the area near the road in restless circles, his nose twitching for the scent of prey. The thought of leaving Quito alone even for a short while made him hesitate, but his own strength was fading. If he couldn't stay strong, he couldn't help him. Near a clump of thorn bush, he caught the faint, quivering scent of something alive. He crouched low, creeping forward until his eyes fixed on a small rabbit nibbling at the dry grass. His heart thumped in his ears as he inched closer, every muscle taut. Then he pounced, his small claws finding purchase just as the rabbit tried to dart away. It was clumsy, ungraceful, but effective. Zuri stood over his catch, sides heaving, the warm weight of it trembling under his paws. He dragged it back toward Quito, his tail flicking with a flash of pride. Dropping the rabbit beside his brother, he tore it into small pieces, pushing them toward the bottle's narrow mouth. But the plastic blocked any hope of food reaching Quito's mouth. The more Zuri tried, the more the bottle shifted against the wound, drawing a low, muffled cry from Quito's throat. At last, Zuri stepped back, the meat untouched between them. His ears drooped. Hunger won over frustration, and he ate the rabbit himself, not out of selfishness, but because he needed the strength to keep trying. That night, the air was colder still. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling around their paws. Quito shivered against Zuri, fever making his skin hot beneath the damp fur. Zuri lay as close as he could, pressing every bit of warmth he had into his brother's small frame. His ears caught the faint rustle of something moving in the distance. Maybe the wind, maybe not. The sound of a hyena's whoop rose again, closer this time. Zuri's lips pulled back in a small, instinctive snarl. He was no match for such predators, but the thought of anything touching Quito filled him with a hot, protective rage. Hours passed in a haze of cold and vigilance. Every so often, Zuri would nudge Quito just to feel him respond, even if it was only a weak twitch. He could tell the fever was burning high now, the scent of infection thick in the air. But still, when the darkness pressed heavy around them, Zuri kept his eyes open, listening to the breathing inside that cursed bottle, and willing it to continue until morning. The third morning broke without the warmth of sunlight. A grey haze hung low over the land, the air heavy and still. Zuri woke to the faint sound of Quito's breathing, a shallow, almost imperceptible rasp that made his chest tighten. His brother's body felt lighter, as if the life inside him had thinned during the night. The plastic bottle was smeared with dust and dew, clouding what little vision Quito had left. His legs twitched when Zuri nudged him, but the movement was weak, almost involuntary. Zuri stood over him for a long moment, his tail flicking in agitation. He scanned the horizon in every direction, ears swiveling, but the land offered nothing. No sign of their pride, no scent of water, no promise of food. His stomach was empty again, a dull ache that had become part of him, but he barely noticed it now. All that mattered was Quito, and Quito was dying. He pressed his head against his brother's side, listening to the unsteady rhythm of his heartbeat. Something in him shifted then, a quiet, unspoken decision that came not from instinct, but from something deeper. If the pride could not find them, maybe the humans would. He had never been close to one before, but their scent carried in the distance, a trace of smoke, oil, and the sharp tang of metal that seemed to cling to the air near the paved road. He had learned, from the murmurs of the adults and the wariness in their eyes, that humans could be dangerous. But now, danger was a lesser threat than the silent one closing in on Quito. Lowering his head, Zuri nudged Quito's flank. Up, his gesture seemed to say. We have to move. Quito stirred, blinking sluggishly behind the smeared plastic, but his legs trembled when he tried to stand. He collapsed after only a few steps, panting heavily. Zuri circled him, licking his ears, then pushed again with his forehead. Bit by bit, step by painful step, Quito followed. The journey began in a slow, halting rhythm, 20, maybe 30 meters at a time before they stopped to rest. Each pause stretched longer as Quito's strength faltered. Zuri stayed patient, waiting in silence until his brother shifted forward again. The land began to flatten, the grass shorter here, cropped by animals or machines. A faint rumble now and then hinted at the road's closeness. The smell of humans grew stronger, mingling with the dry scent of tar and the faint sweetness of spilled fuel. Zuri's ears stayed pricked, his body alert, but he did not turn them back. He knew they were heading somewhere neither of them had been before, and he would face whatever waited there. By midday, the sky had taken on a pale, washed-out look. Quito's legs buckled more often, his head hanging low under the weight of the bottle. Zuri stayed beside him, licking the corners of his eyes when they closed too long, as if reminding him not to give in. The air was warmer now, and small insects buzzed around the wound on Quito's neck. Zuri snapped at them impatiently, as if that alone could keep the infection at bay. The final stretch toward the road felt endless. Zuri could hear the occasional rush of a vehicle, the strange hum and roar cutting across the stillness. Each time he froze, eyes narrowing at the distant blur of motion, waiting for it to fade before urging Quito onward. At last, they reached a strip of land where the grass gave way to gravel and dirt, the ground scattered with flattened plants and tire tracks. Beyond it lay the hard, dark ribbon of the road. Quito stopped there, swaying on his feet. His sides heaved with the effort of breathing, and his eyes, though clouded, still seemed to search for Zuri. Zuri stepped ahead, sniffing the open ground, then returned to his brother's side. He guided Quito to a patch of grass just off the road, where the visibility was clear. The setting sun burned low in the west, casting their shadows long and thin across the earth. As darkness settled in, Zuri lowered himself beside Quito. The road remained quiet, save for the occasional distant growl of an engine. He rested his chin on his paws, his eyes never leaving the horizon. When night fully claimed the land, he began to make a sound. Soft at first, more a kitten's mewl than the rumble of a lion. It was a mix of calls, a plea to any nearby lions, a cry for help to any creature who might understand. The sound carried into the still air, fading and returning, until his throat felt dry and raw. Hours passed. The stars wheeled slowly above, indifferent to the small battle for life happening below. Quito's breathing was shallow but steady, his body curled towards Zuri's warmth. Every so often, a pair of headlights would appear far in the distance, streaking across the road and vanishing again before Zuri could decide if they were worth approaching. The hum of their engines left the air vibrating long after they had gone. When dawn finally arrived, it did so with a soft light that spilled gently over the dry land. Quito was still alive, though the rise and fall of his sides were so faint it was almost invisible. Zuri sat up, his body stiff from the night's vigil. His gaze followed the road, watching for movement. The air was cooler than the day before, a light breeze carrying scents from far off. It was just after the sun had cleared the horizon that a new sound reached his ears. A vehicle approaching, but slower than the others had been. He turned his head, eyes narrowing against the glare. A white pickup truck rolled into view, its engine a low, steady growl. Unlike the other vehicles, this one didn't rush past. It slowed, the tires crunching softly against the road's edge. Two humans sat inside. The one on the driver's side, a man with sun-darkened skin and a solid build, pointed toward the patch of grass where the brothers lay. The other, a woman with silver streaks in her hair, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked. Even from a distance, Zuri could sense the shift in their focus. They had seen him, and they had seen Quito. The truck rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder, the engine idling. The man's hand moved to a small black device on the dashboard, his voice low but urgent. The woman's gaze remained fixed on them, scanning every detail. Zuri stood then, his small frame taut, ears forward. He positioned himself between Quito and the strangers, his tail stiff behind him. Whatever happened next, he would face it first. The wind carried their voices, soft, quick words he didn't understand. But he understood the tone. Concern, surprise. Maybe even something gentler. He glanced once over his shoulder at Quito, then back to the figures by the truck. The moment stretched, the early light pooling across the land as predator and human regarded each other in the still morning air, the road between them holding the weight of a choice neither had expected to make. The woman stepped out of the truck first, her boots crunching against the gravel. She kept her movements slow, careful, her eyes never leaving the two small shapes in the grass. The man joined her, a radio in his hand, speaking in short, clipped phrases to someone on the other end. Zuri's ears flattened at the sound, and he lowered his body slightly, his gaze locked on the strangers. His tail flicked once in warning, but he didn't run. Instead, he planted his paws firmly beside Quito's side, the silent message clear: if they wanted to reach his brother, they would have to go through him. From where she stood, the woman could see the bottle, the deep wound beneath it, and the way Quito's thin body trembled with each laboured breath. She muttered something to the man, who gave a sharp nod. Within minutes, the faint growl of another vehicle carried on the wind. Zuri tensed, his eyes darting toward the sound. A white rescue truck came into view, dust kicking up from its tires. 4 people emerged, 2 wearing the green jackets of veterinarians, 1 carrying a tranquilizer rifle, and another in the dark gear of a field rescuer. They stopped several meters away, assessing the scene. "That little one's not going to let us get close easily," the man with the rifle murmured, his eyes on Zuri. The woman, standing just beside him, nodded in agreement. "We'll have to sedate both of them. Light dose for the younger one." The shooter raised the rifle, moving with deliberate precision. Zuri's ears twitched at the faint click as the safety released. He didn't know the weapon's purpose, only that it was aimed toward him and Quito. When the soft whip of the dart leaving the barrel cut through the still air, Zuri flinched but didn't bolt. The dart struck his flank, and almost immediately another followed, finding its mark in Quito. Zuri's eyes widened, his legs stiffening as a strange heaviness began to seep into his muscles. He tried to stay upright, his gaze darting between the humans as they began to move closer. His breaths came faster, not from exertion but from the instinct to remain standing, to keep himself between Quito and whatever was approaching. The second wave of weakness hit hard, and his body betrayed him. Slowly he sank to the ground, his head still turned toward the figures, his eyes open and watchful even as his vision blurred. The rescue team advanced. One of the veterinarians knelt beside Quito, her hands moving with practiced speed. She pressed 2 fingers to his side, feeling for the steady rise and fall of breath, then glanced at the wound circling his neck. "Still alive," she said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "We have to get this off now." The other veterinarian produced a tool, metal cutters with a narrow, curved edge designed to slice through without touching the skin. Piece by piece, they worked at the plastic, cutting slowly to avoid tearing the flesh any further. As the last section of bottle came free, everyone drew in a sharp breath. The wound was worse than it had appeared from the outside. The skin was deeply indented, the fur matted with dried blood, and a raw ring of exposed tissue marked where the plastic had bitten into him. A sour smell rose from the infection. "Antibiotics, pain relief, now," one of them ordered. Syringes appeared, their contents disappearing into the muscle of Quito's haunch. Another set of hands flushed the wound with a clear liquid, washing away dirt and debris before applying a topical antibiotic. Zuri, though sedated, stirred faintly at the movement around his brother. His head lifted a fraction, his eyes finding Quito. A low, muffled sound escaped him, almost a question. Noticing it, one of the rescuers placed him closer, arranging their bodies so Zuri's paw could rest lightly against Quito's side. There, the rescuer murmured under his breath, he knows he's not alone. With Quito stabilized for transport, the team slid both cubs onto a padded stretcher. The material sagged slightly under their combined weight, and the rescuers worked in pairs to lift them. Dust rose around their boots as they carried the stretcher back toward the waiting truck. The man from the pickup followed alongside, speaking softly into his radio, coordinating with the wildlife center to prepare for emergency intake. Inside the rescue vehicle, the air was cool and tinged with the sharp scent of antiseptic. The stretcher was secured to prevent shifting, and an oxygen mask sized for a cub was fitted loosely over Quito's muzzle to ease his breathing. Zuri lay beside him, the tranquilizer still pulling him under, but not enough to sever his awareness. His eyes stayed half open, the faint reflection of light on the metal walls shimmering in them. Every time Quito shifted or a rescuer touched him, Zuri's ear twitched in response. The drive was long enough for the sedation to deepen. By the time the vehicle rolled into the Thulthula Wildlife Rescue Center, Quito was breathing more evenly, though his body remained limp. Zuri's eyes had closed, but his front paw still rested against his brother's side. Staff members waited at the entrance, the doors swinging open to reveal a clean, bright space lined with cages and treatment tables. The team moved quickly, transferring Quito to a surgical prep area. Zuri was placed in a nearby enclosure where he could see and smell his brother. Dr. Johannes Meyer, a tall man with a weathered face and steady hands, stepped forward, his expression tightening as he examined the wound. "We operate immediately," he said, already pulling on gloves. The staff moved in sync, prepping the operating table, while another vet shaved the fur around the injury to reveal the full extent of the damage. As they worked, Zuri stirred in his enclosure, his head lifting despite the sedative's pull. His gaze fixed on Quito, following every movement of the people around him. One of the staff members crouched near Zuri's cage. "He's watching over him," she said quietly, her tone tinged with wonder. "Even now?" Another nodded in agreement. The scene was almost surreal. Two wild-born lion cubs, one unconscious under the bright lights of an operating room, the other refusing to let him out of sight. The last thing Zuri saw before sleep claimed him completely was Quito being wheeled through a set of swinging doors, the sound of voices and clinking instruments fading into the distance. For the first time in days, the tight knot of tension inside him loosened just a fraction. Quito was no longer alone, and for now, that was enough. The scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood. Under the bright surgical lights, Dr. Johannes Meyer leaned over Quito's small body, his gloved hands steady despite the delicate work. The wound around the cub's neck was raw and deep, the edges swollen from days of pressure and infection. With quiet precision, he cleaned away the damaged tissue, irrigated the area with antiseptic solution, and carefully trimmed away strands of matted fur that clung stubbornly to the injury. His movements were quick but meticulous, each step taken with the understanding that the cub's strength was hanging by a thread. A nurse passed him a fresh set of instruments. "Vitals are stable," she said, glancing at the monitor where a faint green line traced Quito's heartbeat. Dr. Meyer nodded, stitching the deeper layers of tissue before applying a layer of medicated dressing. He ordered a high dose of antibiotics, followed by fluids to combat the severe dehydration. The cub's body was thin enough that his ribs showed beneath the tawny fur, and the pads of his paws were dry and cracked from days without proper rest. In the adjacent room, Zuri stirred in his cage. The sedative had worn off, leaving his muscles stiff but his mind alert. He lifted his head and caught Quito's scent immediately. The soft hum of voices and the distant clink of metal told him his brother was near. He paced the small enclosure, his movements restless, his eyes darting toward the door every time someone passed. When the surgical team finally wheeled Quito back into view, still under anesthesia but alive, Zuri pressed his nose hard against the bars. A low, anxious rumble vibrated in his chest. The staff exchanged glances. "He's not going to settle unless they're together," one said. After a brief discussion, they agreed. Monitors were set up in a larger enclosure, and Quito was gently transferred inside, a heating pad beneath his body to keep his temperature stable. When the gate opened for Zuri, he didn't rush. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes fixed on his brother. He lowered himself beside Quito, careful to avoid the thick bandage wrapped around his neck, and rested his head across his brother's foreleg. The tension in his body eased as soon as he felt the faint warmth beneath the fur. Over the next few days, the recovery process began in earnest. Quito woke for short stretches, his eyes glassy at first, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings. The staff fed him a special liquid diet through a syringe, small amounts at a time, to avoid overwhelming his weakened body. Zuri remained his constant shadow. When Quito stirred, Zuri would shift closer. When Quito drifted back into sleep, Zuri would curl against him, one paw resting lightly on his side as if to reassure himself that his brother was still there. By the end of the first week, there were small but encouraging signs. The swelling around Quito's neck had started to recede. The wound, though still raw, showed early signs of healing. His appetite began to return, and the liquid meals were gradually replaced with finely minced meat. The first time he chewed a piece on his own, the veterinary nurse smiled and noted the moment in his chart. Zuri, watching from inches away, let out a soft chuff of approval. The bond between them did not go unnoticed. Researchers at the centre began documenting their interactions, noting how Zuri's presence seemed to reduce Quito's stress levels. Whenever staff approached for treatment, Zuri would position himself so he could see every movement, sometimes stepping between the humans and his brother until a familiar scent or voice reassured him. "It's extraordinary," Dr. Meyer remarked one evening as he observed them. "This kind of loyalty in the wild, especially among cubs, is rare." 2 weeks into Quito's stay, his energy had improved significantly. His fur, once dull and clumped, was beginning to regain its natural sheen. The deep ring around his neck was still visible, a stark reminder of what he had endured. But the skin was closing over, the infection long since beaten back by antibiotics and careful cleaning. He could stand and walk short distances without wobbling. Zuri often accompanied him on these cautious laps around the enclosure, pacing at his side like a silent bodyguard. The staff allowed them time in a larger outdoor pen during the warmer hours of the day. Here, Quito rediscovered the feel of grass under his paws and the smell of open air. He would lift his head to the breeze, eyes half closed, as though taking in the world again after being locked away. Zuri stayed close, sometimes venturing a few steps ahead to investigate, then circling back as if to report that it was safe. By the third week, Quito was strong enough to chase a tossed piece of meat across the pen. His movements were still a little stiff, but the spark in his eyes had returned. The team began discussing the possibility of release. "He's gained enough weight," Dr. Meyer confirmed, scanning the latest health report. "We can start planning to reintroduce them to the wild." The next question was whether to reunite them with their original pride. Eleanor, who had been part of the rescue, took on the task of tracking the group. She spent days in the northern section of the reserve, following spoor and listening for distant roars. When she finally spotted the pride, they were resting under the shade of a marula tree, not far from a small watering hole. She noted their location carefully. It was only about 15 kilometers from the rescue center. On the morning chosen for the release, the air was cool and clear. The team gathered early, loading 2 transport cages into the back of a pickup. Quito and Zuri were alert but calm, their eyes bright, their ears flicking at every sound. The familiarity they had developed with the staff during their recovery made the process easier. David Simmons, the ranger who had first spotted them by the road, stood by the truck, one hand resting lightly on the metal frame of Quito's cage. "You've got this, little guy," he murmured. The drive took them deep into the reserve, the landscape shifting from open plains to taller grasslands dotted with acacia. They stopped about a kilometre from where Eleanor had last seen the pride. The location offered both space and cover, giving the cubs a chance to reacquaint themselves with the wild before approaching their family. The cages were lifted down and placed side by side, their doors facing the open field. Dr. Meyer knelt to check the locks and ensure the area was clear. "They're ready," he said, straightening. A rope was tied to each door, allowing them to be opened from a safe distance. The team stepped back, forming a quiet semicircle. David gave a gentle pull, and the first latch clicked free, the metal door swinging open. For a moment, neither cub moved. They stood inside the cages, their noses working furiously as they took in the scents of the wind, the grass, the faint musk of other lions, the distant tang of earth warmed by the sun. Zuri glanced at Quito, and something unspoken passed between them. Together, they stepped forward, their paws sinking into the grass. The world stretched out ahead of them, vast and familiar, waiting. The first few steps out of the cages were slow, almost hesitant. Quito paused just beyond the open door, lifting his head to taste the air. The breeze carried with it the layered scents of the grasslands, dry earth, distant antelope, and faint but unmistakable, the musk of other lions. Zuri stood beside him, ears pricked, his tail giving a small flick as if urging his brother forward. For several moments they simply stood there together, two young figures against the sweep of golden grass, before moving on in unison. They kept close to one another as they ventured further, their paws making almost no sound over the ground. The grass brushed against their shoulders, bending in the wind. Every few strides, Quito would pause to glance around, the faint scar around his neck catching the sunlight. It was a mark of the ordeal he had endured, but there was no hesitation in his step now. He moved with the quiet confidence of a predator returning to his rightful place. The air shifted, and from somewhere far ahead came the deep, resonant roar of an adult lion. It rolled across the plain, a sound that was both a warning and perhaps a greeting. Zuri's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes bright. Without a word, he began to trot in that direction, glancing back only once to make sure Quito followed. Quito lengthened his stride, the two of them moving faster now, their small bodies weaving through the tall grass like streams of sunlight. From behind them, the research team watched through binoculars. Eleanor's breath caught when she saw the cubs break into a light run, their bodies growing smaller with each bound. "They're going home," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. David, standing beside her, lowered his binoculars and simply nodded. Neither of them spoke for a while, letting the sight carry its own weight. The moment felt too rare, too perfect to interrupt. The cubs disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the swaying grass. For the humans, that was the end of their part in the story. But for Quito and Zuri, it was the beginning of something else entirely. The smell of the pride grew stronger with each step, guiding them forward. When they finally crested a low rise, they saw movement below, a cluster of tawny shapes resting in the shade. Heads lifted as the newcomers approached, ears twitching, noses testing the wind. A few of the adults rose to their feet, muscles rippling under their coats. There was a tense moment as the pride took in the sight of the returning cubs. Nala, their mother, stepped forward. Her face was unreadable at first, her gaze locked on Quito's scar and Zuri's lean frame. Then she closed the distance in a few quick strides, lowering her head to sniff each of them in turn. A deep, rumbling chuff escaped her throat, followed by a low, vibrating purr. The rest of the pride moved in, circling them, their bodies pressing close in brief touches that spoke more than any sound could. Whatever time they had been apart dissolved in that instant. Life within the pride resumed quickly. The cubs were folded back into the rhythm of the group, sharing shade during the heat of the day, playing in short bursts, learning the patient art of stalking through the grass. Quito's recovery continued, the muscles in his legs strengthening with each hunt practice. Zuri was rarely far from his side, his eyes always alert, his body quick to match his brother's pace. 6 months later, during a routine wildlife survey, Eleanor spotted the pride again. From her vantage point in the research vehicle, she lifted her binoculars and scanned the group. Her eyes caught on 2 sub-adults lying side by side near the edge of the gathering. One was larger now, his shoulders broader, his coat sleek and healthy. Even so, the faint ring of lighter fur around his neck still showed where the bottle had once trapped him. The other, slightly smaller, with the same alert eyes as before, lay so close their flanks touched. Eleanor smiled, recognizing them instantly. "Quito and Zuri," she whispered, almost to herself. She jotted a note in her research journal later that evening. "It's miraculous to see them so strong. But more miraculous still is how inseparable they remain." Her pen paused over the page as she reflected on what they had endured and how, in the wild, survival often demanded separation. Yet here they were, defying that rule. News of their rescue had long since travelled far beyond the reserve. Photographs of the bottle, cleaned, preserved, and displayed at the Thulthula Tourism Centre, hung beside images of Quito's recovery. Visitors stopped to read the story, their faces shifting from shock to admiration as they learned about the cub who had endured days without food or water, and the brother who had refused to leave him. Conservation groups had taken the story as a rallying point, launching campaigns to combat plastic waste in protected areas. Volunteers gathered in increasing numbers to clear litter from fence lines, riverbanks, and grasslands. School programs used the brothers' survival as a way to teach children about responsibility toward wildlife. David spoke about them at the International Conservation Conference that year. Standing at the podium, he recounted the morning he had first seen them by the road, how Zuri had stood like a small sentinel beside his unconscious brother. "We often think of animals as creatures driven only by instinct," he told the audience. "But if you had been there that morning, if you'd seen the way Zuri refused to move, you'd know it was something else entirely, something we call love." For Quito and Zuri, none of that mattered. They roamed the reserve with their pride, hunting, resting, and growing into their roles. The grass whispered under their paws as they moved in sync, always aware of where the other was. When Quito drank from a waterhole, Zuri stood nearby, scanning the horizon. When Zuri chased a fluttering bird through the reeds, Quito followed. His pace steady, his eyes soft. One evening, as the sun slid low and the sky turned to gold and rose, the pride lay sprawled across a warm patch of earth. Quito stretched out on his side, eyes half closed, while Zuri settled against him, their tails brushing. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and a chorus of crickets rose from the grass. The world felt quiet, safe, and whole. Neither of them knew their story had reached millions of people, or that their bond had become a symbol for something far larger than themselves. All they knew was that they were together, as they had been from the start, as they intended to remain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, more challenges would come. The wild was never still, never without risk. But for now, under the fading light, the brothers rested. And in that moment, in the heart of Thulthula's vast grasslands, the strongest instinct was not survival. It was the unspoken promise that had carried them through every trial. I will not leave you.